Welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 7 of the NFL season. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. The first game was the Broncos versus the Saints. The Broncos won 33-10. The Broncos' leading passer is Bo Nix, who had 164 yards. Their leading rusher is Javonte Williams, who had 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Troy Franklin. And then for the Saints, their leading passer was Spencer Rattler, who had 172 yards. Their leading rusher was Kendre Miller, who had 36 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cedric Wilson, who had 57 receiving yards and a touchdown. So during this game, Spencer Rattler just looked bad. The whole Saints team looked bad. I get it, they're injured. They had no Chris Olave, no Derek Carr, no Rashid Shaheed, who's out for the season. Marshawn Lattimore got injured during the game. Just a really pitiful performance by the Saints. And the Broncos, they look decent. Their defense looks really, really great. Bo Nix showed off his rushing ability with 75 rushing yards. And Bo Nix just didn't make any mistakes. He didn't look spectacular, but he didn't make any mistakes. And that's kind of what you want from him out of your rookie year so far. So just overall, the Saints, I think they can be a good football team, but they just are too injured right now. And at the end, Jake Haener came in, and I think he looked pretty good. So I definitely give him a shot next week over Spencer Rattler, just because Spencer Rattler just did not look good at all whatsoever. The next game is the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the New England Patriots. The Jaguars won 32-16. The Jaguars' leading passer is Trevor Lawrence, who had 193 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Tank Bigsby, who had 118 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Brian Thomas Jr., who had 89 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Patriots, their leading passer is Drake May, who had 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Ramondre Stevenson, who had 18 rushing yards. And their leading who was tied with Drake May, who also had 18 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Hunter Henry, who had 92 receiving yards. So for the Jaguars, they really needed this. They've been struggling a lot. I don't know if Doug Peterson will get fired or not, but they've been struggling quite a bit. Trevor Lawrence, he didn't look like anything special, but he didn't make any mistakes. And then Brian Thomas Jr. looked really good, and Tank Bigsby looks like an absolute stud. It does get me curious if they are going to trade Travis Etienne, just because with Tank Bigsby playing so well, they don't really need him. And I think a team like the Cowboys, who are super desperate for a running back, will give up probably a third or fourth round pick for Travis Etienne. And then the Patriots, Drake May looked pretty good. Their running game was non existent. Their wide receivers are still battling drops and having issues. And Jalen Polk, he's been kind of having issues with their head coach, Jerod Mayo, because what happened was he kind of dropped a pass and last week, and he claimed that he had the best hands in the league. And now this week, Jerod Mayo called the team soft and called him out for dropping another pass, and just overall it seems like those two are having issues. And Jerod Mayo, obviously, I don't think he's going to get fired anytime soon, but it does concern me that maybe he's lost the locker room at least a little bit, because he seems like one of those tough, hard-nosed coaches, and to be one of those tough, hard-nosed coaches, you need to have the locker room respect you and believe in your mission. And that's why you don't see many of those anymore, and that's why Bill Belichick was able to do it for so long, is because he had the Super Bowl saying, hey, I have a process that works, whereas the new head coaches simply just do not have that yet. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus the Houston Texans. The Green Bay Packers won 24-22. The Packers' leading passer was Jordan Love, who had 220 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. The leading rusher is Josh Jacobs, who had 76 rushing yards, and their leading receiver is Romeo Doubs, who had 94 receiving yards. And then for the Texans, their leading passer was C.J. Stroud, who had 86 receiving yards. Their leading rusher is Joe Mixon, who had 115 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Dalton Schultz, who had 28 receiving yards. So this game, the Packers looked really good. Jordan Love did make 2 terrible interceptions, which he shouldn't have done. And that seems like he's just turning into a volatile quarterback, where it feels like every single throw is like the best throw you've ever seen, or every single throw will be the worst throw you've ever seen. There's no in between. That's basically it. but the Packers defense was super clutch. They were harassing CJ Stroud all game, and CJ Stroud looked absolutely terrible during this game. He was missing receivers left and right. He was constantly pressured, and it seems like also Jair Alexander just owns Stefon Diggs. I think if I saw correctly, they've had 8 games together, and he's been targeted 7 times with only, I think, like 3 catches for 23 yards in total. And Stefon Diggs just can't do anything against Jair Alexander. So it was really the Packers defense that saved him, and then Brandon McManus kicks the game-winning field goal. So I think the Packers have solved their issues at kicker, and so I think the Packers are going to be a dangerous team. And realistically, if their kicker made those field goals, the Packers could potentially be 6-0 right now. And so now Brandon McManus is in, and he probably solved their field goal issue. And overall, the Packers just look really, really great. And the Texans, I don't think there's too much concern. They have a good record, but CJ Stroud just didn't play well today, and hopefully he'll pick that back up soon. The next game is the Detroit Lions versus the Minnesota Vikings. The Lions won 31-29. The Lions' leading passer is Jared Goff, who had 280 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 116 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had 112 yards and 1 touchdown. For the Vikings, their leading passer is Sam Darnold, who had 259 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher is Aaron Jones, who had 93 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Justin Jefferson, who had 81 receiving yards and a touchdown. So this was a close game. I'd say Jared Goff has looked great the past 3 weeks. He has almost been perfect the past 3 weeks. And I would say him and Lamar Jackson right now are the 2 top leading MVP candidates, in my opinion. Jahmyr Gibbs looked really good. David Montgomery did have that horrible fumble that nearly cost them the game. But overall, this Lions offense is humming. Their defense didn't look that great. Brian Branch had a great interception on Sam Darnold. But overall, I still think their pass rush has some cause for concern, especially without Aiden Hutchinson. Now that it seemed like Hassan Reddick has solved his issues with the Jets, I do think they will probably get Zadarius Smith, because he's hinted that he wanted to go to Lions, because he is very angry at the Packers for cutting him, and then very angry at the Vikings for trading him, and he kind of wants revenge on both teams. And then Sam Darnold, he looked pretty good. Aaron Jones looked good. I think both these teams looked really good and were both really good teams this year. And I don't think there's really cause for concern, for either of them. And then it was really weird at the end of the game because Sam Darnold spiked the ball, but they had an illegal formation penalty. And I don't know what happened because at least on the TV version of the game, there was 0 seconds left when Sam Darnold spiked the ball. It might have been different in the live game, that there could have been 1 second left. But it was weird to me that it seemed like there was 0 seconds left. He snapped the ball with 1 second left. When he spiked it, there was 0 left. And then they got called for an illegal formation, and that stopped the clock and gave him 1 more play. I don't understand what happened there at all. So I'm wondering, is that just a new thing now? Or it's okay, just have someone line up in a lineman line up the backfield in a legal formation, and that'll stop the clock for you if you want the clock stopped. I have no idea what happened there, and it was never really explained what happened there. But overall, these 2 teams played really good, and it's unfortunate for the Lions that they're going to be out without Jameson Williams for the next 2 games because of a suspension for using performance-enhancing drugs. But overall, these teams look good, and I think they're going to be great for the next weeks to come. The next game is the Seattle Seahawks versus the Atlanta Falcons. The Seahawks won 34-14. The Seahawks' leading passer is Geno Smith, who had 207 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Kenneth Walker, who had 69 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is DK Metcalf, who had 99 receiving yards and a touchdown. For the Falcons, their leading passer is Kirk Cousins, who had 232 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Bijan Robinson, who had 103 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Kyle Pitts, who had 65 receiving yards. The Seahawks looked really good. Geno Smith looked really good. Kirk Cousins kind of played a terrible game. He was getting harassed all night long. This is kind of the first game the Seattle Seahawks defensive line actually looked decent. And then Geno Smith, he was kind of back to form. They beat up on some pretty bad teams so far, and that's why they had a decent record. But now they beat an actual good team. DK Metcalf did get injured. I don't know what his injury status is just yet. But overall, this was a good game. I wouldn't be too concerned for the Falcons because your division is kind of terrible. The Buccaneers also lost. And then the Seahawks, also, the division's terrible, and you're still in it for the playoffs. I don't think they're going to be a Super Bowl team, but the Seahawks are definitely going to be close to playoff contention. Next game is the Tennessee Titans versus the Buffalo Bills. The Bills won 34-10. The Bills' leading passer is Josh Allen, who had 323 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Ray Davis, who had 41 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Ken Coleman, who had 125 receiving yards. And then for the Titans, their leading passer was Mason Rudolph, who had 215 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 61 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Chigziam Okanowo, the tight end. I know I butchered his name. It's a hard name to pronounce. Anyways, the Bills looked really good, and the Titans simply didn't. And that's kind of the story of the year. Will Levis got injured, it seemed like right before the game. And they put Mason Rudolph in. Mason Rudolph clearly is not the answer. Did not look good, and I assume they'll go back to Levis next week. And the Bills just look great. Josh Allen, again, I'd say at least close to the MVP conversation because he's really not turning the ball over or making many mistakes. And then Amari Cooper, I think he's been a little bit of a lightning rod for this offense, giving them another threat. Whereas before, they really didn't have anybody, it felt like. And they're still winning and playing well, but they didn't have a guy that teams are actually scared of. And now with Amari Cooper, they are looking really, really good. The next game is the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Cleveland Browns. The Cincinnati Bengals won 21-14. The Bengals' leading passer was Joe Burrow, who had 181 yards, 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Chase Brown, who had 44 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is T. Higgins, who had 82 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Browns, their leading passer was Deshaun Watson, who had 128 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who had 22 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cedric Tillman, who had 81 receiving yards. So, big story of this game is Deshaun Watson gets injured, tears his ACL, and is going to be done for the year. I feel like we need to separate this injury into 3 parts. The football aspect of it, the human aspect of it, and then the joke aspect of it. Obviously, when people make jokes of it, it's pretty funny, and I don't think you should take them seriously. Like, kind of the good thing about the one positive thing about this injury is that Deshaun Watson's going to get a lot of massages. But the jokes, like I said, I think they're all good-natured fun and don't really mean anything. And then the human aspect of it, you gotta really feel bad for Deshaun Watson because he was actually playing pretty well in this game before he got injured. And he's had a disastrous season so far. He has a disastrous year for the Browns and a career with the Browns so far. And I don't know if it's the lawsuits messing with his head or if it's just him just not playing football for 2 years really kind of got him out of the game. But it seems like he's just not playing well, and his head's been a little bit out of the game. Like, it really killed me last week when I believe it was their head coach, Kevin Stefanski, wanted to go for it on 4th down, and Deshaun Watson just walked off the field. Like, no, we're not doing it. We're not going for it on 4th down. And so you just got to really feel bad for the guy. Everything seems to be going wrong, and I don't know if there's going to be a solution anytime soon. But the good thing for the Browns is, although the contract is fully guaranteed and there isn't really an injury out for them, they still have to give Deshaun Watson that. But now they do get a chance to see someone else. And because with his fully guaranteed contract, you couldn't really trade Deshaun Watson, you couldn't cut him, and you couldn't bench him. Whereas now you get an opportunity to see someone else. I think their record is bad enough where their season is over. Like the Bengals, the Ravens, and the Steelers are all looking too good for the Browns to come back. So I'd just give Dorian Thompson-Robinson a shot at seeing what he's got. He did not look good in this game, but maybe he can improve. Jameis Winston, I just struggle seeing him as the future of the Browns, and so I think it'd be kind of wasted just playing him. And then for the Bengals, Joe Burrow looked fine. He looked, nothing great, nothing terrible. He didn't make any mistakes. And that's kind of it. Like, the Bengals, I don't think are a bad football team. The only issue is that it feels like they've dug themselves a little bit of a hole, and especially with their division being so good, it's going to be a struggle for them to make the playoffs. Because realistically, you're going to need to be at about 9-8 to make the playoffs. And right now they're 3-4, so theoretically, could they be 6-5 in the next 11 games? Yeah, I think they could. So they do have a shot. It will still be difficult, but they still have a shot at making the playoffs. The next game is the Indianapolis Colts versus the Miami Dolphins. The Colts won 16-10. Their leading passer is Anthony Richardson, who had 129 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Anthony Richardson, who had 56 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Michael Pittman, who had 63 receiving yards. And for the Dolphins, their leading passer is Tim Boyle, who had 74 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Devin Achane, who had 77 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jonnu Smith, who had 96 receiving yards and a touchdown. So, say about this game, it was just terrible. Anthony Richardson is not looking good. I do think it's too early to give up on him, but he's just not looking good. And they definitely took a step back going from Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco. It does make me think, since they do have a winning record and are 4-3, do they maybe want to put Joe Flacco on there and say, hey, let Anthony Richardson learn, just hope he gets better, and maybe roll Joe Flacco for the year because you're actually not out of playoff contention? I think that's what I would do because the Texans are good, but overall their division is not necessarily super amazing. So I think the Colts definitely have a shot at the playoffs, and so I'd roll Joe Flacco. And then the Dolphins, they're just terrible. Tyler Huntley's not the answer. He got injured, and Tim Boyle doesn't seem like the answer either. And this is what I kind of think is Mike McDaniel is losing a little bit in the sense that you cannot run the same offense for every quarterback. He's kind of refusing to change anything, and that's why I think Matt LaFleur should get a lot of credit because he completely revamped his offense to work with what Malik Willis was good at and saying, hey, Malik Willis and Jordan Love are two separate quarterbacks, and we need to do what's good for Malik Willis. Whereas it feels like Mike McDaniel just doesn't want to do it, where he doesn't want to do what Tyler Huntley's good at and wants him to be just like Tua, and he's just not. And so overall, luckily the Dolphins will get Tua back, and they're at 2-4. They're definitely enough time to pull it back for the playoffs because that's kind of the thing is the issue with the adding the extra game and adding the extra playoff team in the sense that it's going to be a little while before any team is really out of the playoffs and cannot make it. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the New York Giants. The Eagles won 28-3. The Eagles' leading passer was Jalen Hurts, who threw for 114 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 176 yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was A.J. Brown, who had 89 receiving yards and a touchdown. And then for the Giants, their leading passer was Daniel Jones, who had 99 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Tyrone Tracy, who had 23 passing yards. And their leading receiver was Malik Nabers, who had 41 receiving yards. Jalen Hurts really didn't do much, and he looked fine in his role, but Saquon Barkley went off. I know he said it didn't really mean much to him, but you can tell this game meant everything to him. He had one of the best games of his career and just looked amazing. This was the Saquon Barkley game, or solely him. He's kind of solely the reason they won. And then Daniel Jones looked bad. He had no explanation for it. He just didn't look good. The running game was non-existent. Just the Eagles' defense really stepped up and stopped the Giants' offense. And also, the Giants' offensive line is beat up, and the team is beat up. And I don't see a future for the Giants. And I don't know if they want to stick with Daniel Jones and hope he kind of... Because Daniel Jones isn't terrible every single game. He has a game every once in a while where he plays well. So I don't know if they want to stick with him or maybe switch to Drew Lock and see if Drew Lock gives you a little bit of a spark. But overall, the Eagles, this is maybe their best game of the year. And it was solely due to Saquon Barkley, but their defense also looked good. And then the Giants, just a world of trouble for the Giants, and there's really no good solutions. The next game is the Los Angeles Rams versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Rams won 20-15. The Rams' leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who had 154 passing yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 76 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Tyler Johnson, who had 57 receiving yards. And then for the Raiders, their leading passer was Gardner Minshew, who had 154 yards and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Antonio Madison, who had 92 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Brock Bowers, who had 93 receiving yards. So this game, the Kyren Williams looked great again and really helped the Rams win. Matthew Stafford did struggle a bit, but also he has no pass catchers, and it looks like he's going to get Cooper Kupp back, which will be really good for him. And I do think the Rams can turn this around, and their division is clearly wide open. And just the Rams are just injured, simple as that. And then the Raiders, they're terrible. I do think Antonio Pierce is going to get fired after this year. Gardner Minshew is not really the answer. I did see, so Aiden O'Connell got injured and is going to be missing quite a few games. I can't remember what happened. I think he broke his hand, maybe? It was something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. And they did sign Desmond Ridder, and I don't see Desmond Ridder being the answer. But Alexander Madison is looking pretty good, and Brock Bowers is an absolute stud. So that's a very good positive for the Raiders. That at least their future quarterback will have Brock Bowers. The next game is the Washington Commanders versus the Carolina Panthers. The Commanders won 40-7. The Commanders' leading passer was Marcus Mariota, who had 205 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Brian Robinson, who had 71 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Terry McLaurin, who had 98 receiving yards. And then for the Panthers, their leading passer was Andy Dalton, who had 93 receiving yards and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Chuba Hubbard, who had 52 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Jatavion Sanders, who had 61 receiving yards. So what to say about this? Marcus Mariota looked really good, and the Commanders' offense looked really good. So it's kind of two sides you have to look at this, in the sense that it does give you a little bit of happiness if you're the Commanders saying, hey, our offense is good enough to run well even with Jaden Daniels not playing. Because Marcus Mariota looked really good, and it does give you confidence if Jaden Daniels has to miss time, Marcus Mariota can fit the offense. But on the flip side of it, the Panthers are so terrible, it kind of makes everyone look good against them. And I hate to really say it that, the Commanders looked that great because it's the Panthers, and they're so unbelievably terrible. There's really no good for the Panthers. They're the worst team in football. I do think they should give Bryce Young another shot, just because Andy Dalton is playing so bad that maybe Bryce Young can give him a little bit of a spark. But just overall, the Commanders played perfect against a terrible Panthers, or the Commanders played perfect against a terrible Panthers team, and the Panthers just, they have no hope. Their season is over, and I just don't know what to say for them. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the San Francisco 49ers. The Chiefs won 28-18. The Chiefs' leading passer was Patrick Mahomes, who had 154 passing yards and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Kareem Hunt, who had 78 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Noah Gray, who had 66 receiving yards. And then for the 49ers, their leading passer was Brock Purdy, who had 212 passing yards and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Jordan Mason, who had 58 receiving yards. And their leading passer was George Kittle, who had 92 receiving yards. So, let's say about this game, Patrick Mahomes looked terrible. But it's kind of good in the sense that they've really shown that Patrick Mahomes, yes, is clutch, but he's been kind of terrible in the past, really kind of couple of seasons. He's not been that good, and they've been really a defensive-focused team, and that's good in the sense that, hey, they don't need him to win them games. It does bother me, though, is that Patrick Mahomes is allowed to kind of run on a lot of teams, and I get it. A lot of teams are terrified of hitting the quarterback because they treat the quarterback as a completely separate runner than any other one. But sometimes it just makes the game look soft and horrible when players are giving up on the ball when it looks like the quarterback's going out of bounds and then the quarterback can run for another 15 yards. And then for the 49ers, their season isn't over yet, but they're in a lot of trouble. Everybody is injured. In this game, Brandon Ayuk tore his ACL and is done for the year. Deebo Samuel, I saw that he had pneumonia and fluid in his lungs and is hospitalized, so I don't know what's going on with him. Hopefully he will be okay pretty soon, but it looks like he might miss the next game. And then Ricky Pearsall's probably their number one receiver, even though he just got shot a month ago. And it's just bad news for their team with injuries and just overall just really tough sledding for the 49ers, and I don't know if they can come back. The next game is the New York Jets versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers won 37-15. Steelers' leading passer was Russell Wilson, who had 264 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. The leading rusher was Najee Harris, who had 102 rushing yards and a touchdown. The leading receiver was George Pickens, who had 111 passing yards and a touchdown. And then for the Jets, their leading passer was Aaron Rodgers, who had 276 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Breece Hall, who had 38 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Breece Hall, who had 103 receiving yards. So this game, I feel like the narratives don't really fit what actually happened in this game. Like, for example, Russell Wilson, he did look good. And this is why I did say in my prediction video, comparing Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Russell Wilson is the better passer than Justin Fields. Justin Fields is the better runner. And this is basically how it's going to be. Is Justin Fields has not been making mistakes and been relying on a strong defense. So Justin Fields has not been losing you games, but he is not the reason you're winning games. Whereas I think Russell Wilson, he's the guy that's going to throw a lot of great passes and a lot of terrible passes, and he's literally going to be the reason you win your game or be the reason you lose their game. And so overall, I think I'd rather have Russell Wilson in that situation. And Russell Wilson did play pretty well. He did underthrow George Pickens quite a bit, but then George Pickens just had a knack for the ball and just played amazing. And then talking about the Jets, because I think that's the big storyline, because now they're 2-5. Luckily, there's so much games to play left, they can bring it back, because realistically, they need about 9 wins to make the playoffs. Can they go 7-3 in the remaining games? Maybe. Aaron Rodgers, he really didn't play that bad, and honestly, the Jets probably should have won this game, because the two key plays in this game were the 2 interceptions by Beanie Bishop. The first interception, should Aaron Rodgers probably throw in that ball? Probably not. It wasn't the greatest pass in the world, but it really was just an amazing one-handed interception by Beanie Bishop. And then the second one was not Aaron Rodgers' fault at all, because it literally just hit Garrett Wilson right in the chest, and it got intercepted. Garrett Wilson should have caught it, and honestly, the Jets probably should have won this game. And I do think the Jets' record is a little bit misleading. And another missed field goal by Greg Zuerlein. Well, actually, it was a blocked field goal, but Greg Zuerlein has just been terrible this year. Like, look at these games. Okay, they lost to the 49ers by 13. That was a bad game. Then they beat the Titans by 7, beat the Patriots by 21. They lost to the Broncos by 1, and that had included a missed field goal, so I feel like they could have won that one. They lost to the Jets by 6, which was a bad game, and then they lost to they lost to the Vikings by 6, and then they lost to the Bills by 3. And in that game where they lost to the Bills by 3, there was so much terrible calls. I think it equally affected both sides, but there were so many terrible calls where the Jets could have won that, and they had 2 missed field goals. So if those field goals are made, then they would have won. So looking at their upcoming schedule, I think the going 7-3 is definitely possible, because they have the Patriots, who are terrible. They have the Texans, who C.J. Stroud's coming off a terrible game, but I do think the Texans are good. They have the Cardinals, who are so off and on, really depending on Kyler Murray. Sometimes Kyler Murray plays great, and sometimes Kyler Murray plays terrible. But on their bright side, it is after Call of Duty comes out, so maybe Kyler Murray will play worse. Then they face the Colts, who are terrible. They face the Seahawks, who are really not playing well. They face the Dolphins, who knows what the Dolphins look with Tua now, because Tua is kind of coming back from injury. They play the Jaguars, who are terrible. They play the Rams, who might be decent now that when they're healthy, and they probably will be healthier in December. They play the Bills again, who are good, and then they play the Dolphins again, which who knows what the Dolphins look like. So out of those, I definitely think they can be 7-3. It's going to be tough. It's going to be a long road if they might have dug themselves in too big of a hole to come out of. But I do think the season's not over with the Jets, and let's just see what they do. Because their offensive line did struggle quite a bit, and Garrett Wilson did look pretty good. Or not Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall did look really good, and I just think they're going to only get better from here. So we'll see what the Jets can do. The next game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Baltimore Ravens won 41-31. The Ravens' leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who had 281 yards and 5 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Derrick Henry, who had 169 yards. And their leading receiver was Rashad Bateman, who had 121 yards and 1 touchdown. And for the Buccaneers, their leading passer was Baker Mayfield, who had 370 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Rachaad White, who had 40 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cade Otton, who had 100 receiving yards. So there's really a big story of this game is the Buccaneers. Mike Evans came into the game with a hamstring injury and then left with a hamstring injury. It doesn't seem like super severe, but he might miss a few games. And then Chris Godwin, I don't know what the injury is as of right now, but it did look like a really bad injury. They did have to cart him off, potentially torn ACL done for the year. I don't know exactly what it was. It also could have been a dislocated knee, so I don't know. But it just didn't look good, and I think Chris Godwin is for sure going to miss the next few games. And then for the Ravens, Lamar Jackson looked really, really good. And then Derrick Henry looked really good, and honestly, Baker Mayfield didn't play that bad. He had the 2 interceptions, which one of those was absolutely terrible. Well, actually, both of them were terrible and shouldn't have happened. And honestly, I think if he doesn't throw those 2 interceptions, the Buccaneers really could have won this game. But overall, I think both teams looked good. Ravens looked great. Both defenses kind of struggled a bit, but the story of the game is the top 2 Buccaneers receivers going down, and that's just going to be a major, major problem going forward for them. The final game of the week was the Arizona Cardinals versus the Los Angeles Chargers. The Cardinals won 17-15. The Cardinals' leading passer was Kyler Murray, who had 145 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was James Conner, who had 101 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Trey McBride, who had 51 receiving yards. And for the Chargers, their leading passer was Justin Herbert, who had 349 passing yards. Their leading rusher was J.K. Dobbins, who had 40 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Will Dissly, who had 81 receiving yards. The story of this game is Justin Herbert actually looked pretty good. He doesn't have a lot of great pass catchers, but he looked really good. The Cardinals clearly just wanted to shut down the run game, and that's what they did, because the Chargers like to go through the run, and that was their goal, to run the ball, and the Cardinals overall shut them down. The Cardinals kind of just skated by. They really didn't look good in this game. And then the Chargers just need to finish in the red zone. They had 5 field goals. You can't do that. You just need to be able to finish drives, and they struggled a lot. So, honestly, I think you're disappointed if you're both teams. Like, at least with the Cardinals, you got the win. But overall, I think neither team looked that great. And honestly, I think the Chargers were the better team of the night. So that's what happened in Week 7 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money, and I'll see you on the next one.